The bullet missed by 4 inches. Not a terrible shot for a beginner, but Claire Lawson was not a beginner. She lowered the rifle, pressed her lips together, and stared downrange at the paper target flapping in the dry desert wind. 4 inches. She had trained 3 times a week for 6 months. She had watched every video, read every manual, asked every question she could think of, and the bullet had missed by 4 inches. The Arizona sun was already doing its worst by 9 in the morning. The kind of heat that sits on your shoulders like something physical. The shooting range outside Tucson was a wide, flat strip of land bordered by scrubland and silence, the kind of place that felt like it existed slightly outside of ordinary life. 8 lanes. Steel target frames. A small corrugated metal building at the back where the instructor kept his notes, his coffee, and a fan that barely worked. Claire had driven 2 hours to be here. She had taken a day off work. She had packed her rifle case with the same care she packed everything, methodically, quietly, without making a show of it. She was the kind of woman who did things properly, who showed up prepared. She was also, on this particular morning, the only woman on the range. That fact had not bothered her when she arrived. It had not bothered her during the safety briefing. It had not bothered her during the first round of dry fire practice. She was used to being the only woman in rooms. 9 years in the United States Army, 3 of them deployed, had cured her of any expectation that rooms would look like her. What bothered her was the voice. It came from 2 lanes over, from a man she had clocked the moment she arrived, the way you clock a certain kind of person without meaning to, the way your instincts flag them before your brain catches up. He was somewhere in his late 40s, thick through the shoulders, wearing a hat that advertised a brand she didn't recognize. He had arrived with 2 friends and a rifle that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He had spent the first 20 minutes of the session telling those friends about a shot he had made in Colorado last hunting season. The distance kept growing each time he told it. His name, she would learn later, was Gary Phelps. He sold insurance in Phoenix and came to the range about once a month, which was often enough to feel confident and not quite often enough to actually be good. When Claire's 4th shot of the session drifted left, Gary said it loud enough for the whole row to hear. She won't hit the target without a scope. Not to her. Not even about her exactly, more to the air, to his friends, to the general atmosphere of the range, as if he were commenting on the weather. His tone was not cruel in the way that a shout is cruel. It was worse than that. It was the kind of casual certainty that doesn't expect to be challenged because it has never had to be. His friend on his right laughed, a short sound quickly swallowed. Nobody said anything else. Claire did not turn around. She had learned over many years and in many rooms that turning around was sometimes exactly what a comment like that was designed to make you do. So she didn't. She kept her eyes on the target. She kept her hands on the rifle. She breathed the way she had been taught to breathe, slowly, from the belly, letting the air move through her without force. But she had heard it, every word. And the thing about a comment like that, the thing that people who make them rarely understand, is that it doesn't disappear when the sound stops. It lands in a person's chest and sits there. Not as hurt, necessarily. Not even as anger, not right away. More like weight. Like something extra she now had to carry through the rest of the morning, on top of everything else she was already carrying. She had come to this range because she wanted to get better. That was the whole reason. She was not trying to prove anything to anyone. She was not on a mission. She was a 37-year-old woman who had served her country, come home, built a quiet life, and decided that precision shooting was something she wanted to learn properly. That was all. That was the entire story. And now there was Gary. She took another shot. This one drifted right. She exhaled through her nose and started running through her checklist in her head: stance, grip, trigger pull, breath control, natural point of aim. Something was off in her fundamentals. She could feel it without being able to name it. the way you can feel a word sitting just outside your memory. The instructor had not said anything about Gary's comment either. His name was listed on the sign-up sheet as Dan Hollies, and Claire had looked him up before registering for the course because she always looked things up. The bio on the range's website was brief, retired military, 15 years of service, certified firearms instructor, available for private and group sessions. There was no photograph. The reviews were uniformly good, leaning toward a particular kind of praise. No nonsense patient actually knows what he's doing. She had not been able to find much else about him, which she would come to understand was entirely intentional. Dan Hollies was standing at the far end of the line when Gary made his comment. He was watching a young man in lane 1 work through his grip. He did not visibly react to what Gary said. He did not look up. He did not intervene in the obvious way that an intervention is usually staged, the public correction, the teachable moment made into a performance. He just kept watching the young man's grip. But something shifted in how he held himself. A small thing, the kind of adjustment that only happens when a person has decided something. Claire took 2 more shots. Both of them were closer, within 2 inches of center, but still not where she wanted them. The wind had picked up slightly, coming in from the northwest, and she had not accounted for it properly. She knew the theory of reading wind. She had practiced it on paper. Applying it in real time, with the sun in her eyes and a stranger's words still sitting in her chest, was something different. She set the rifle down and rolled her right shoulder. It had been bothering her for weeks, an old strain from her service years that came back whenever she spent too long in a shooting position. She had learned to manage it, to work around it, to not let it show. Another thing she had learned to carry without making it visible. Down the line, Gary was shooting. He was actually a decent shot, she noted with the fairness that had always been one of her better qualities. Better than decent, in fact. His groupings were tight and centered, and he handled the rifle with the ease of someone who had grown up with firearms and never had to think about the basics. She could give him that. She could observe it plainly and give him what was true. What she could not give him was the rest of it. She pulled a water bottle from her bag and drank slowly, looking out across the scrubland beyond the range. A hawk was circling something in the distance. The wind moved through the dry grass in slow, rolling waves. It was genuinely beautiful out here if you stopped thinking about everything else for a moment. That was one thing about the desert. It was always beautiful, and it never cared at all whether you noticed. She noticed. When she turned back to the line, Dan Hollies was walking toward her. Not toward Gary, not toward the young man in lane 1, toward her. He walked the way certain people walk, without hurry, without performance, with the kind of physical economy that comes from years of moving through difficult places and understanding that wasted motion costs something. He was not a large man. Medium height, lean, somewhere in his mid-50s, with the kind of weathered face that outdoor years produce. He was wearing a plain gray shirt and carrying a clipboard he seemed to have forgotten was in his hand. He stopped at her lane. He looked at her rifle for a moment, then at the target downrange. "What distance are you working at?" he asked. 200 yards, she said. He nodded. "What's the wind doing?" She looked out at the range. She watched the way the flag at the end of the line was moving, the way the grass beyond the berm bent. Coming northwest, maybe 8 to 10 miles per hour, gusting slightly. He looked at her. Just that, a flat, level look that she could not entirely read. "And what adjustment did you make?" She told him, the number, the direction, the reasoning behind it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're adjusting for the wind at the firing line. You're not accounting for what it does at the midpoint." She stared at him, and then slowly she understood. The wind at the midpoint of the bullet's flight, where the projectile was moving through a slightly different airstream, was something she had read about but had not, in practice, been calculating properly. It was one of those things that existed in theory until the moment it suddenly became real. That's where you're losing it, he said. He did not say it as a criticism. He said it the way a mechanic tells you which part is worn as information, useful and plain. He started to walk away. She said, "Is that why it's drifting right?" He stopped, turned back. "Left-handed or right-handed?" "Right." "Then it's not just the wind," he said. "You're also anticipating. Just before the trigger breaks, you're flinching forward, barely." "But enough." She opened her mouth and then closed it again. Because he was right. She knew he was right the moment he said it, could feel the memory of it in her trigger finger, the ghost of that small, almost invisible mistake. "How do you fix it?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment, not sizing her up. Something else, the look of a person deciding how much time a situation is worth. "Come back at 4, he said, "after the group session ends." He turned and walked back down the line. She watched him go. Then she turned back to her target, adjusted her elevation, made a note on the small card she kept in her front pocket about the midpoint wind calculation, and took another shot. It was 1 inch from center. Gary Phelps, 2 lanes over, did not notice. He was busy explaining to his friend again about the shot he had made in Colorado. The distance had grown by another 50 yards since the last telling. Claire Lawson noted the improvement on her card, rolled her right shoulder once, and loaded the next round. She would be back at 4. There is a particular kind of quiet that exists on a shooting range after the morning session ends, and the afternoon crowd has not yet arrived. It is not quite silence. The wind keeps moving. A target frame creaks. Somewhere in the corrugated metal building at the back, the broken fan makes a sound like something trying very hard. But the human noise is gone, the voices, the reports of rifles, the shuffling of equipment bags, and what is left feels thin and clear, like water that has been standing still long enough to show the bottom. Claire Lawson sat on a bench outside the building at 3:30, eating a sandwich she had packed that morning, and watching the heat move across the scrubland in visible waves. She had not left the range between the morning session and now. She had driven 2 hours to be here, and she was not going to waste half of it on the road. She had spent the afternoon hours sitting with her rifle manual, going back through the chapter on wind compensation, making notes in the margins in her small, careful handwriting. She had also spent some of that time simply sitting, thinking, letting the morning settle into something she could look at without flinching. The comment still bothered her. She was not going to pretend otherwise, even to herself. It bothered her not because it had shaken her confidence. She had been shaken before, by things considerably larger than Gary Phelps, and she had learned that confidence was not a fragile thing if you had built it properly, but because of its casualness. Because he had said it the way people say things they have said 1,000 times without consequence. Like a habit. Like something comfortable and worn smooth by repetition. She had met that habit before. In uniform, out of uniform, at ranges like this one, and in rooms that had nothing to do with rifles. The specific words changed. The shape of the habit did not. What she had not let herself do, sitting in the morning sun with the comment still fresh, was let it make her smaller. That was the trap. That was what a comment like that was designed to do, whether Gary Phelps had designed it consciously or not, to make the target of it take up less space, want less, expect less, stop trying quite so hard. She ate her sandwich. She made her notes. She took up exactly as much space as she needed. At 5 minutes to 4, Dan Hollies walked out of the building carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to her without asking whether she wanted it. She took it, "Thank you." He sat down on the bench at a comfortable distance and looked out at the range. He was not, she noted, the kind of person who filled silence with noise. He drank his coffee and let the afternoon air do what it wanted. She said, "Were you in the military?" "Yes," he said. "Branch?" He looked at her for a moment. "Navy." She nodded. "I was Army, 9 years, logistics." I know, he said. She paused. How? The way you handled the rifle this morning, the way you stood, the way you didn't react when that man said what he said. He looked back at the range. You counted to something before you went back to your lane. Old habit, it's a regulation thing. She stared at him for a moment, then she laughed, a short, real sound. That's a strange thing to notice. It's not strange, he said. It's what I was trained to notice. They drank their coffee. The fan inside the building made its struggling sound. She said, "What did you do?" "In the Navy." He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I was a SEAL, 15 years. I specialized in long-range target acquisition." A pause. "What you would call a sniper." The words landed quietly, without drama. The way he had walked down the line that morning, without performance, without the desire to impress. He said it the way you say what you did for work, plainly, because it was plain to him. Claire looked at him, then she looked back at the range. "And you've been teaching here," she said. 3 years, he said. "I like the work." She thought about the way he had walked toward her that morning. Toward her, not toward Gary. She thought about the question he had asked, not about her background, not about how long she had been shooting. About the wind, as if the only thing worth knowing about a shooter was what they observed. "Why did you ask me about the wind first?" she said. "This morning." He looked at her. "Because your stance was fine, your grip was fine, your eye relief was correct, the mechanical side was solid. What I needed to know was whether you were thinking about the problem or just reacting to it. And if I hadn't known about the wind, then we would have started there," he said. "But you knew, you just weren't applying it all the way through." He stood up and set his coffee cup on the bench. "Come on," he said. "Let's use what's left of the afternoon light." They walked back to the range together. He picked up a rifle from the equipment rack near the building, not her rifle, one of the range's own, and carried it with the loose, automatic comfort of someone for whom a rifle is simply a tool, no different from a wrench or a level. He set up in her lane. He checked the equipment on the target frame, standard iron sights, no magnification. Nothing added, nothing enhanced. He looked downrange for a moment, watching the flag, watching the grass beyond the berm, doing whatever calculation lived in his hands and eyes and 15 years of experience. He did not speak about what he was doing. He did not narrate it. He simply did it. And then, without ceremony, without build-up, without announcing what was about to happen, he lay down, settled into the rifle, breathed once and fired. The sound cracked across the flat desert air and vanished. At 200 yards, the target paper registered a hit so close to the absolute center that the 2 other instructors who had wandered out of the building to refill their coffee cups stopped walking and looked at each other. One of them walked down the line to the target. He came back holding up the paper so the hole was visible. Dan Hollies was already on his feet, already handing the rifle back to the rack. "No scope," Claire said, "not a question." "Never needed one at this distance," he said. And then, because he was not a man who made speeches, he moved on. "All right, your lane. Let's talk about the flinch." For the next 40 minutes, Dan Hollies taught Claire Lawson to stop flinching. He did not do it with speeches. He did not do it with demonstrations of his own superiority. He stood beside her lane and watched her shoot, and every few rounds he said something small and specific. A word about her elbow, a note about where her eye was focusing, a quiet correction about the moment she was choosing to begin her trigger pull. He gave her a drill for the flinch dry fire, with a coin balanced on the muzzle, until the trigger broke clean and the coin did not fall. Over and over. Patient in the way that people are patient, when patience is not an effort but a default. She had been coached before. She had had good instructors and bad ones. She knew the difference between a person who was teaching and a person who was performing teaching. Dan Hollies was teaching. At one point he said, "You're managing something in your right shoulder." She had not mentioned the shoulder to anyone. She had not let it show in her movement, her expression, her grip. She had been managing it so automatically that she had almost forgotten she was doing it. "Old strain," she said. "From service." "Yes." He nodded. He adjusted her position slightly, moved her elbow half an inch, shifted the angle of her support hand. "Try that." She tried it. The pressure on her shoulder dropped significantly. Not gone, but reduced. Manageable in a different way, a less costly way. She looked at him. "I've seen it before," he said simply. "Lot of people carry things from service, in the body and otherwise." He paused. "The body part is usually easier to fix." It was the closest either of them came, that afternoon, to talking about the morning. About Gary Phelps and his casual carry-on comment. About what it meant to be the person in the room that a stranger had decided, without evidence and without hesitation, was incapable. Dan had not needed to say anything more direct than that. She understood what he meant. She suspected he knew she understood. By the time the afternoon light began to turn gold and the shadow of the berm crept across the lane, Claire was shooting tight groups. Not perfect, not yet, but consistent and deliberate, each shot the product of a process she was beginning to trust. She stripped and cleaned her rifle at the bench, while Dan made notes on his clipboard. The other instructors had gone back inside. The range was quiet again. She said, "Why did you come to me this morning, before the afternoon session, when you could have just let it go?" He finished writing something on his clipboard. He did not look up immediately. When he did, his expression was the same one she had been trying to read all day, steady, composed, slightly difficult to interpret because it contained more than it showed. "Because you were asking the right questions," he said. "With your adjustments, with your notes. You were in there solving the problem. That deserves attention." He paused. "And because what that man said was wrong. Not offensively wrong, I don't mean that. Technically wrong. You were close. You just needed the right information." He capped his pen. "I don't like wasting good shooters," he said. She carried that sentence home with her. 2 hours back through the desert dark. The rifle case loaded in her trunk and the afternoon still sitting warm in her hands. Not the demonstration. Not the sound of that shot cracking out across the flat, still air at 200 yards. Not the silence that followed it, or the way the other instructors had looked at each other, or the way Gary Phelps's friends had stopped laughing for a while after that. The sentence, that one sentence said plainly without drama. She didn't let it sit in her chest the way Gary's comment had sat there. She let it move through her instead, like good air, like the kind of breath that actually reaches the bottom of the lungs. She drove. The desert went by dark and enormous on both sides of the highway. She was already thinking about next week. The third time Claire Lawson came to the range, she did not need to be told to account for the midpoint wind. She did it automatically, the way you do things that have moved from knowledge into habit, without thinking about it, without congratulating herself, without even being fully aware she was doing it. The calculation happened somewhere below her conscious attention and surfaced as a natural adjustment, as easy and as ordinary as breathing. Her first group of the morning was clustered inside an inch of center. She looked at it, she noted it on her card, she loaded the next round. Dan Hollies was working with a group of 4 at the far end of the line, a corporate outing of some kind, men in their 30s who had bought matching hats and were experiencing the gap between their confidence and their skill in real time. He had the patient, unhurried manner he always had. He was showing one of them something about grip without making the man feel foolish for not already knowing it. That was the skill Claire had come to understand, not the shooting itself, though the shooting was extraordinary, but the way he taught. The way he handed people their own competence back to them instead of displaying his. She shot for an hour without interruption. The shoulder was better, not healed. It would never be fully healed, but managed, positioned the way Dan had shown her, costing her less. The flinch was mostly gone. Mostly. It came back when she was tired or distracted, a ghost of the old habit, and she had to recognize it and let it pass before the trigger broke. Some mornings were better than others. This morning was good. Gary Phelps was not there. She had not seen him since the first session. She did not know whether he had stopped coming to this particular range, or had switched days, or had simply never come back after the afternoon of Dan's demonstration. She had thought about it once or twice during the weeks between, not with satisfaction, or not only with satisfaction, but with something more complicated. She had thought about what it meant that he had said it so easily, that the words had come out of him with no resistance, no pause, no moment of considering whether they might be wrong. That kind of certainty about another person's limits was not really about shooting, she had decided. It was about a habit of the mind, a groove worn smooth by repetition, a way of seeing that had never been asked to justify itself. She did not wish him anything specific. She simply hoped, in a general way, that something would eventually ask it to justify itself. She was loading her 5th magazine of the morning when Dan broke away from the corporate group and walked down to her lane. He stood behind her and watched her shoot 2 rounds. He said nothing. She shot 2 more. Still nothing. She lowered the rifle and turned. "Flinch is down," he said. "Mostly," she said. He almost smiled. She had noticed over the weeks that he almost smiled quite a bit. It was as close as he usually got. "Your natural point of aim has moved. You reset it." "Every time," she said, "before each string." He looked at her target. He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was computing something. "Have you thought about competition?" he said. The question surprised her. What kind of competition? "Precision rifle. There's a regional series, civilian division open to anyone with a verified training record." He paused. "The next qualifier is in 4 months, in New Mexico." She looked at him. "You think I'm ready for something like that?" "I think," he said, "that in 4 months, if you keep doing what you're doing, you'll be ready." He looked back at the target. "The question is whether you want to." She looked at the target too, at the tight cluster near center, at the evidence, plain and factual, of the work she had put in. "I'll think about it," she said. He nodded and went back to the corporate group. She thought about it for approximately 45 seconds. Then she made a note on her card: New Mexico, 4 months, find registration details. She was the kind of woman who did things properly. There were 6 other women in the precision rifle qualifier in New Mexico, held on a clear October Saturday at a range outside Albuquerque. Claire had done her research on the other competitors, on the course of fire, on the specific environmental conditions of the high desert in autumn. She had driven up the day before to walk the range in the afternoon light and feel the difference between Tucson air and Albuquerque air. There was a difference. 1,000 feet of elevation, and the wind behaved differently. She noted it. She made adjustments in her head before she had fired a single round. The event drew 43 competitors. Military veterans, law enforcement, serious hobbyists, a handful of people who competed on the national circuit and were doing this qualifier as warm-up. The energy at the registration table was a particular kind, concentrated, competitive, serious. People checking each other's equipment with sidelong looks and arranged casualness. Claire registered. She got her competitor number. She went to her assigned position and set up without talking to anyone, not out of unfriendliness but out of focus. She had learned, over the years of doing things competitively, that other people's energy could be contagious in the wrong direction if you let it in too early. Dan Hollies was not there. She had not expected him to be. He was not that kind of teacher, the kind who followed you to the test to sit in the corner and watch. He had given her everything he had to give in the lanes of that range in Tucson, in the 40-minute sessions that extended across 3 months, in the small, specific corrections and the plain, practical sentences. He had told her, the last session before she left for New Mexico, that she had the mechanics. The rest, he had said, is between you and the problem. The course of fire ran through 5 stages over 6 hours. Variable distances, variable positions, variable wind conditions. Shots from standing, kneeling, sitting, prone. Some stages with a time component. Some with unknown distances that competitors had to estimate using only their equipment and their judgment. The unknown distance stages were where a scope helped most. In the obvious, literal sense, magnification made estimation easier, made wind reading more precise, made the distant targets more readable. Claire had a scope. She was not performing some statement by refusing one. She was not trying to prove the morning at the Tucson range all over again. She used the tools she had. She had built her skills on iron sights because that was where Dan had started her, because fundamentals lived in the unassisted eye before they lived anywhere else, and because the scope became meaningful only when you already understood what it was helping you see. By the 3rd stage, she was sitting in 4th place overall. By the 5th stage, she was in 2nd. The woman in 1st place was named Alice Ford. She was from Colorado, 31 years old, and she had been competing in precision rifle for 4 years. She was composed and technical and shot with the unshowy efficiency of someone who had absorbed the fundamentals so deeply they had become invisible. Claire watched her between stages with undisguised respect. Alice Ford shot a better final stage, not by much, by the kind of margin that in another context you might call negligible, but that in precision shooting was simply the difference. Claire finished 2nd. She stood at the scoring table and looked at the number for a long moment. 2nd, at her first qualifier, against 43 competitors, including several from the national circuit. She noted it on her card. She drove back to Tucson in the dark. She stopped for food at a place off the highway that had been there since before she was born, the kind of diner that smelled like coffee and old wood and didn't ask you any questions. She ate slowly and looked out the window at the parking lot. She was not disappointed. She examined herself carefully, the way she examined targets, looking for the honest truth of what was there, and she was not disappointed. She searched for the accurate word, motivated, sharpened, specifically focused in the direction of Alice Ford and the fraction of margin that had separated them. 2nd place had information in it. She intended to use it. She called Dan on the drive home. He picked up on the 2nd ring. 2nd, she said. A pause. How was the wind in the final stage? She told him exactly. He listened. He said 2 sentences. She drove in silence for a moment, holding what he had said. Same problem, she said finally, reading it at the line instead of through the full flight path. It's the last thing to become automatic, he said. It takes longer than people expect. I'll be back Thursday, she said. I'll be here, he said. She hung up. The desert went by on both sides of the highway, enormous and unhurried. The same hawk she imagined from the first morning, some descendant of it, anyway, some cousin of that circling shape, was probably out there somewhere in the dark, reading the wind with absolute accuracy, adjusting without thinking about it, having never needed anyone to explain that this was even a skill. She had 4 months until the next qualifier. She was already thinking about Alice Ford. And about the wind at the midpoint. By the time spring came to Tucson, Claire Lawson had changed. Not in any dramatic, visible way. She did not carry herself differently in the obvious sense, did not dress differently or speak differently or announce to the people in her daily life that something had shifted. She was still the same woman, the methodical one, the quiet one, the woman who packed things carefully and showed up prepared and did not make a show of any of it. But something inside her had moved, the way tectonic things move slowly below the surface, producing no visible event at the time, and yet eventually changing the shape of everything above. She had spent the winter on the fundamentals. Not the exciting parts of shooting, not the dramatic distances or the technical equipment discussions that filled online forums, but the grinding, repetitive, unglamorous work of building skill into the body so deeply that the mind no longer had to manage it. She had done the coin drill until the coin stopped moving. She had dry-fired thousands of times in her living room with the television off and her phone in the other room. She had studied wind, not as a concept but as a physical language, learned to read it in tree branches, in grass, in the way dust moved across an open parking lot, in the behavior of flags from a distance, in the feel of it on the back of her hand. Dan Hollies had continued to be her instructor in the way he was always her instructor, with the patient, plain attention of someone who was genuinely interested in the problem, and not at all interested in performing that interest. He had added distance to her training gradually, moving her from 200 yards to 3, then to 4, then to 5, each step only when the previous one had settled into reliability rather than occasional success. He pushed her when she was ready to be pushed and left her alone when she needed to work something out herself, with an accuracy of judgment about which was which that she found, over time, remarkable. She had asked him once. It was a cold February morning, the rare kind of cold that descended on Tucson in winter, both of them standing at the line with the wind cutting steadily from the north, how he knew the difference, how he knew when to push and when to wait. He had thought about it. He took his time answering questions, which was one of the things she had come to count on about him. When someone is working a problem, he said finally, you can see it in how they stand, how they breathe between rounds, whether they're frustrated or whether they're thinking. He paused. Frustration needs time, thinking needs information. They look similar but they're different things. She had thought about that for a long time after. She had also, over the course of the winter, told him more about herself than she had intended to. Not in one conversation, not in any one moment of deliberate disclosure, but in the accumulative way that happens between people who spend hours working on something difficult together. The Army came up, naturally, the years of service, the specific textures of a logistics role, the way military life organized time and thought and expectation in ways that were hard to fully undo even years later. The shoulder came up, and with it the context around the injury, which was not a dramatic story but was a real one. The fact of being a woman in military spaces came up, obliquely, in comments she made about certain experiences that she did not elaborate on, but that Dan received without pushing. He told her things too. Not many. He was not a man who spoke about himself easily, but some. A deployment he described only as long, a period after leaving service that he described only as difficult. The way teaching had given him something to do with what he knew that felt, in his words, like it was worth something. She understood that, the wanting what you know to be worth something. The second qualifier was in May. Santa Fe this time, higher altitude, different wind patterns, a course of fire that heavily weighted the unknown distance stages. She had been preparing specifically for it since January, when the registration details were posted online. She had driven to Santa Fe in March to walk the terrain. She had built a data book on the specific environmental variables of northern New Mexico in late spring. She had, in the weeks before the event, slept well and eaten carefully, and done everything in her preparation that was within her control. Alice Ford was there again. They recognized each other from the fall and nodded across the registration table, the small, mutual acknowledgement of people who have competed before and know what the other is worth. There were 51 competitors this time, more from the national circuit. The field was deeper. Claire shot the first 4 stages with the focused calm of someone who has spent a winter becoming the same person every time she picks up a rifle. No variation in her routine, no adrenaline-driven changes. The same process, executed the same way, producing results that were consistent in a way that first qualifier results rarely were. In the 5th stage, the longest unknown distance stage, shots from 600 yards at a target she could not range with any device. She made the adjustment she had been building toward all winter. She read the wind not at the firing line. She read it through the full arc of the bullet's path, accounting for the layered differences in air movement at each phase of the flight. She made the calculation. She trusted the calculation. She did not second-guess it when the wind gusted at the moment she was settling, because she had already accounted for the gust within the model. She fired. The target registered a hit. Alice Ford, shooting the same stage on the adjacent course of fire, hit the same target. Her shot was a fraction of an inch closer to center. But it was a fraction, a true fraction. Claire finished the event. She stood at the scoring table for the second time and looked at the number for a long moment. She had tied Alice Ford. In precision rifle competition, a tie is broken by the record of hits across all stages. Alice's total record was marginally better, 2 additional hits on the more difficult timed stages in the middle of the day. Claire had missed one on a timed stage in the 3rd hour, when the light shifted, and she had taken a half-second longer than she should have. Alice Ford won. Claire finished second. Again. She sat in her truck in the parking lot of the Santa Fe Range for a while, with the engine off and the window down. The mountain air was clean and thin and moved through the cab with a quiet, steady pressure. Around her, other competitors were packing up equipment, loading cases into trucks, having the post-event conversations that happen in parking lots, animated, relieved, already analyzing what went wrong and what went right. She was not upset. She examined herself carefully, as she always did, and found that upset was not the accurate word. She found something else, something she had not felt at the end of the fall qualifier, or at least not with the same sharpness. She found that she was close. Not generally, not in the vague way that people tell themselves they are close when what they mean is that they are making progress. She was close in a specific, measurable, documentable sense. The margin between her and the top of this field was no longer a gap in fundamentals. It was a gap in execution detail, specifically in the timed stages, where her time management was strong but not quite at the level of competitors who had done this for 4 years. That was fixable. She knew exactly how to fix it. She called Dan. He picked up on the second ring. Second again, she said. Same person, same margin. The timed stages. 3rd and 4th, she said. I lost a half-second in the 3rd, light shift. He was quiet for a moment. How was the unknown distance? Better, she said. Significantly better. I made the full flight path calculation, hit it at 600. A pause that felt from him, like the equivalent of a long sentence. Then you're doing the hard part right, he said. The timed stages are a speed problem, she said. I need to get faster without losing the process. Yes, he said. That's going to take drilling. Yes, he said again. She looked out the window at the mountains. They were purple-blue in the afternoon light, enormous and permanent and entirely unconcerned with everything happening in the parking lot below them. Thursday, she said. Thursday, he said. She drove home through the mountains and the desert, through the long light of the late afternoon, through the change from high altitude to lower altitude that you can feel in your ears and your chest if you are paying attention. She was paying attention. She was thinking about the timed stages, about the half-second, about what lives in a half-second and how you go about taking it apart. She was also thinking, for the first time in months, about a morning in Tucson on a flat, dry range, and a man in a hat who had said something casual and comfortable into the morning air. Not with anger. Anger had been useful for a while in the early months the way anger can be useful. It had given her something to push against, but she did not need it anymore. She had something better than anger. She had a data book full of wind calculations and a record of consistent improvement, and a specific, fixable problem to solve. She thought about Gary Phelps for approximately 30 seconds. Then she thought about Alice Ford. Then she thought about the half-second and how she was going to find it. The third qualifier was in September. Back in Arizona this time, a range outside Flagstaff, high plateau country, the kind of landscape that made you feel like the air was different because it was cool for September. The sky the saturated, impossible blue that the high desert produced in fall, as if the atmosphere were showing off. Claire had spent the summer drilling. Not exclusively the timed stages, though those got the most attention. She had built a home practice routine around a modified version of Dan's coin drill that introduced a time pressure element, a small timer she kept on the bench that she could hear but not see. She had also worked on the broader picture, her transition speed between positions, her ability to reset her natural point of aim quickly without losing accuracy, her consistency under physical fatigue. She had added early morning runs to her routine, not because she needed the fitness for the act of shooting, but because she had noticed, after studying her own data, that her worst performance clusters happened in the last two stages of a six-stage qualifier. Fatigue was a factor. She would not pretend otherwise. She had also, in July, traveled to a 3-day training event in Colorado that featured several national circuit competitors as guest instructors. She went to learn, not to perform. She kept her notebook and asked questions, and did not care about being seen doing either. She came home with 17 pages of notes and 2 adjustments to her hold technique that she practiced for 6 weeks before they felt natural. Dan had seen the adjustments on her first Thursday back after Colorado. Colorado, he said, not a question. 3-day clinic, she said, national circuit instructors. He nodded. He watched her shoot 2 rounds. He made one small observation about how the new hold interacted with her shoulder management and left her alone to work it out. She had thought, driving home from Colorado, about what it meant to be teachable. Not in the obvious sense, she had always been teachable in the obvious sense, had always been willing to receive instruction and apply it. She meant something more specific. She meant the willingness to be in the middle of the process, visibly in the middle of it, without needing the process to look like mastery. The willingness to be seen learning, to show your notebook, to ask the question that admits you don't already know the answer. She thought about Gary Phelps again. She thought about how certain his voice had been, how ready, how completely armored against the possibility of being wrong. She thought about what it cost, that kind of certainty, what you had to give up in order to maintain it, what you could never learn. She thought about it once clearly, and then she let it go. 58 competitors registered for the September qualifier. Alice Ford was on the list. So were 8 people from the national circuit, including a man named Connor Birch, who had won 3 regional championships in the past 2 years, and whose name came up in online forums with the hushed frequency of someone who had already been decided upon. Claire arrived in Flagstaff the evening before. She walked the range in the fading light, reading the plateau terrain, noting where the wind channeled between the rock formations to the north, watching the grass at various distances. She ate dinner alone at a restaurant in town and slept 7 hours. She woke before the alarm. She drove to the range in the dark and was the 4th person to arrive. She set up her equipment methodically. She ate the breakfast she had packed. She did her dry fire routine in the space behind the registration table, not caring who watched. She checked her data book. She made 3 notes. When the event began, she was ready in the specific way that readiness actually means something. Not the readiness of someone who has decided they will do well, but the readiness of someone who has done all the preparation that was possible to do and is now simply willing to find out what it adds up to. The first stage went well. The second stage went better. By the third stage, she was in the settled state she had first experienced at the fall qualifier, and had been trying to reproduce reliably ever since. The state where the process ran without effort, where she was not thinking about each component separately, but experiencing them as a single continuous action. The way a skilled driver does not think about the pedals and the wheel and the mirrors separately but simply drives. She was in fourth place after 3 stages. The fourth stage was the one she had been thinking about since July. It was a timed stage, 5 shots from standing at 400 yards with a 90-second limit. This was the category of stage that had cost her the half-second in Santa Fe. She had drilled this more than anything else. She had the drill so deep in her body that she had done it correctly in her sleep once, waking to the sense of having solved something. She shot the timed stage clean, all 5 shots, inside the time limit with 6 seconds to spare. She noted it on her card without allowing herself to react. There was still a stage to go. The 5th stage was the unknown distance. This was where the qualifier had been decided in Santa Fe. She walked to her position, settled, looked downrange at the target she could not range, and began to read. The wind was coming from 2 directions at once, a primary movement from the north, a cross-current from the east, the kind of layered condition that the plateau geography produced and that a single reading at the line would misrepresent entirely. She read it for longer than she might have 6 months ago. She was willing to spend the seconds it took to be accurate rather than fast. She made her calculations. She made her adjustments. She fired. She knew before she checked the target. There is a feeling, when the shot breaks exactly right, that comes from the complete alignment of all the things you have been practicing. A kind of clean, physical sense of correctness that you learn to recognize only after you have felt it enough times. She had felt it more reliably over the past year than she ever had before. The target confirmed it. She stood at the scoring table at the end of the day and looked at the number. First place, overall 58 competitors. She stood there for a moment. She did not cry. She did not perform anything. She was not sure what she felt, exactly, something large and quiet, something that didn't have a precise name. Something that had been accumulating for a year and a half of early mornings and careful notes and 100 sessions on a flat range in Tucson. And behind all of that, further back, 9 years of service and a great deal of carrying things without showing it. Alice Ford found her at the equipment tables and extended her hand. "That timed stage," Alice said, with the frank appreciation of one competitor for another. "Where did that come from?" Claire shook her hand. "I found a half-second," she said. Alice laughed. It was the laugh of someone who understood exactly what that meant. Connor Birch, who had finished 3rd, stopped by on his way to his truck. He was a compact, precise man in his early 40s who did not waste words. He looked at Claire's equipment. He looked at her data book, which was sitting open on the bench. "Who taught you?" he said. "Dan Hollies," she said. "Out of Tucson." Connor Birch was quiet for a moment. Something moved across his expression, recognition, something close to respect. "Dan Hollies is teaching again," he said. "Yes," she said. He nodded once, then he picked up his case and walked to his truck. She did not know what history lay behind that reaction. She made a note to ask Dan about it. Then she thought about it and decided she didn't need to ask. Some things were complete without the full story. She had learned that. She called Dan from the parking lot. He picked up on the second ring. She said first. A pause. "The timed stage," he said. "Clean," she said. 6 seconds to spare." "The unknown distance." "Layered wind from the north and east," she said. "I spent extra time reading it." "And it was worth it," she said. Another pause, longer, the kind of pause that from him carried more than silence. "Good," he said. That was all, not a speech, not an elaboration. The single word said plainly, in the voice of a person who had expected this and was now simply registering that it had happened. She drove home as the sun dropped toward the western edge of the plateau, and the sky did what Arizona skies do in the evening, turned colors that seemed unlikely, until they were right in front of you, orange and rose, and a deep, burning gold that lasted longer than you expected and then was gone. She stopped at the same diner off the highway, the same smell of coffee and old wood. She ordered the same food. She sat at the same window booth. She took her data book out of her bag and opened it to a clean page. She wrote the date. She wrote the result. She wrote 3 specific things she intended to improve before the next event. Then she closed it and ate her food and looked out at the parking lot and the desert beyond it. Somewhere in Phoenix, Gary Phelps was probably doing whatever Gary Phelps did on a Saturday evening. She did not know. She would never know. She thought about him for approximately 20 seconds, not with anger, not with triumph, not with any of the sharp feelings that had sharpened her in the early months. With something closer to pity. Not a dismissive pity, a real one. The pity of someone who has seen, from the inside, what learning costs and what it gives back, and who can imagine what it must be like to never find out. She finished her food, she paid, she left a good tip. She drove the last hour home through the dark desert, and the target she had shot that day, clean, centered, the product of a year and a half of honest work, was already folded in her range bag. Not framed. Not displayed. Just kept. The way you keep the things that prove something you already knew. The scope was never the point. It had never been the point. The point was the wind, and the patience to read it all the way through, and the willingness to keep showing up until the reading became something you did without thinking about it. The point was the half-second you find when you stop pretending you don't need to look for it. The point was a man who walked toward her instead of past her, on a hot morning on a flat range, and asked her about the wind before he asked her anything else. The point was everything she had carried into that range on the first morning, and everything she had built there, and the long, quiet, unglamorous, utterly necessary work of becoming better than you were. She pulled into her driveway. She sat in the truck for a moment with the engine off. She was already thinking about the next qualifier. She was already thinking about the wind.